Well, good morning, church. How are you guys doing today? I apologize if I look a little red in the face right now. My girlfriend's tuning in online. I'm just a little nervous. I'm totally kidding. We were actually at the beach, and you'd think, being a natural Floridian, I would have this down pat after 30 years. Like, it doesn't change, okay? The sun always wins. And yet, every time I go to the beach, I have this little thought in my head as I'm going there. I'm like, you know what? This year's going to be different. I've got this. That raging inferno is not that great. I can do this. And when I get to the beach, this wrestle between me and the sun is like me stepping into the UFC octagon with a 250-pound heavyweight named Vince the Killer, okay? It never ends well. I always go there, I'm like, I hope I'm going to be okay. I'll be fine. Little did he know he would not be fine. But we're here. We're happy, guys. I'm super excited to get to be part of this series and what we're doing, looking back over the Old Testament and seeing some of these great heroes of the faith, men and women that we look at, that Scripture actually points us to as an example. Hey, you want to know what it looks like to pursue the Lord wholeheartedly? Follow these people. And this whole time we've been looking at this verse in the book of Hebrews. It's kind of like our focus verse, our flag, our banner that we're flying. It's from Hebrews 12, and it says this: "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us." And you see, this cloud of witnesses that the author of Hebrews is referring to, they're individuals that have actually lived out their faith successfully. Now, it's important to note that none of these characters are perfect. This cloud of witnesses is not referring to Jesus. It's referring to flawed, broken, depraved human beings who did their best to follow the Lord, fell short many times, and yet persisted nonstop in pursuing God. Now, I don't know about you, if you guys have someone in your life that you look up to, and maybe has set an example for you time and time again that is kind of your North Star when things get difficult or they go wrong, choices twist, that you're able to look back at that person. I have a guy in my life, he's one of my mentors. I worked for him. His name was Bill Jessup. And Bill Jessup, to me, is like the epitome of leadership. He's amazing. He's a red temperament, if you're into those. He's a type 8 on the Enneagram. So you picture like this just brute, like, I'm going to direct you where you need to go. Don't talk back to me. And yet he was also one of the most gracious and inspiring people I've ever met. It blew my mind watching how he would use his personality and his temperament and his gifts to encourage people and inspire them to Christ. Every time I worked with Bill, whether things went great, whether they went wrong, I always walked away going, that's where I need to be heading. That's what I need to do. That's who I need to aspire to be like. That is a man who's following after Christ. And in the same way, the author of Hebrews is saying these individuals are like that. They are people that we can look to, and when things get difficult, when you're not sure what to do, they can give you an idea of where you should be heading. And so we've looked over the past few weeks, Pastor Brian, Pastor Robert, and myself, we've looked at Moses, we've looked at Ruth, we've looked at Jacob and Abraham, these huge heroes. And today we're looking at one more. But the interesting thing is, this character that we're looking at, he only has a very small portion in this narrative in Hebrews. He's literally mentioned in a sentence with about 5 other people that you wouldn't typically think are great heroes of the faith. And we find this in Hebrews 11, the chapter right before. The author of Hebrews writes this: "What more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war." I mean, these are some amazing accomplishments. I mean, we look back over that: stopped the mouths of lions, conquered kingdoms, quenched the power of fire, became mighty in war. Now, I don't know how many of these apply to ladies. I'm not a lady, so I can't really vouch for you. But I know as a dude, a lot of these characteristics, I'm like, yeah, I can do that. I can quench the sword, absolutely. I can become mighty in war. Little did he know he could not. But these accomplishments are truly amazing, and the author of Hebrews is very intentionally showing us these great things these characters did. But what we can't forget is we skip down 2 verses, these accomplishments did not come without a cost. And I think a lot of times when we look at these old school heroes, we forget that. We look at the highlights of their life, much like an Instagram story, and we're like, man, these characters are amazing. And we forget that on the flip side, there were some things that they also faced, and we see this in verses 35 and 37. You see, the author says that some were tortured, others suffered mocking and flogging, even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, wandering about in deserts and mountains, in dens and caves of the earth. Now let's be honest, if Pastor Brian walked up here next week in goat skin, okay, how many of you would be in awe of that man? I would be in awe because I'm like, that man has so much confidence. I can follow a man like that. But if we're being honest, if we saw someone like that, we would typically think that person has some problems, or that person's homeless, or that person's fallen on hard times, or they're part of some cult. And, as I was looking over this, I was thinking, what would I actually do for Christ? And, what came to mind was like giving my life. And I think that we've glorified, even in modern culture, the idea of martyrdom. Maybe not actually dying, but like losing yourself for some kind of cause. And we look at, yeah, absolutely, I would die for my faith. But would I be ridiculed every day of my life for my faith? Maybe not. Would I be okay with my friends and family absolutely despising me? Not the estranged aunt and stepbrother that, they don't like me anyways, but like the family members that you love and adore, your kids, your son, your daughter, your spouse, your mother, your father. Will we be okay if they looked at you for the rest of your life and said, I absolutely cannot stand you, I hate you, because we follow Christ? Will we be okay with people actually mocking and ridiculing our reputation each day? I think so often we're much more apt to fight for our reputation than anything else. Someone speaks bad about me. I know me personally, that's the first thing that I go for is my reputation. Someone speaks bad about me and they're wrong, it riles me up. And I don't know whether I'd be willing to give up that and be destitute, afflicted, and mistreated for the sake of pursuing Christ. But we see that these men and women were willing to go through that kind of treatment because they were committed to something so much bigger than themselves. And as I was reading through this passage and looking at this, I started asking myself, what would actually cause someone to go through this? I love Jesus. I wish I had him figured out more than I actually do. I wish I was bolder. I wish I understood more. I wish all these things. But what would make someone like me, a regular individual, go through all this for the sake of the gospel? And I think it's one word, and it's our word for today. South Lake kids, if you guys are in here, we're going to count number one right here. It's the word hope. Hope. Now, the interesting thing is this word has changed over the years in how we use it. Typically, when you use the word hope, according to Merriam-Webster, we use it to mean that I want or am expecting something. I want something to happen, or I want something to be true. I hope that tomorrow I'll be 3 inches taller. You never know. The Lord's done bigger miracles. I hope I'll win the lottery. I hope that I'll have my job at the end of this year. I hope that Pastor Brian won't fire me. These things that we want to be true. I hope that I can get half off at Five Guys for lunch. Never know. But actually, if we look back, there is an archaic definition, a definition that we don't use for hope anymore, even according to Merriam-Webster, and that's this. It's a one-word definition, and it's this: trust. You see, years past, the word hope actually meant trust. When you placed your hope in something, it wasn't that you were just wanting something to happen. It was a very clear affirmation that I believe this thing is worth my hope. I believe this thing is worth my trust, worth my time, worth my affections. And the hope that we're looking at today is not this kind of passive, I hope that things will get better. I hope that my story will change. I hope that there's a good ending. It's this, I trust that God is big enough to bring this to a good ending. I trust that God is good enough to resolve this, to restore this. And I think that there's a whole lot more hope in that definition than in the first one. And the individual that we're looking at today is a man by the name of David. And everyone knows David. Kids, you've probably heard the story David and Goliath. It's an awesome story. Young David goes out and fights this giant. And David has many moments throughout his life where he has these incredible opportunities to stand for God. But on the flip side, David also has a lot of times in his life where he royally messes up. In fact, in most times when we talk about David, we refer to one of his mess-ups than one of his successes. And we kind of use him like a fable to teach us, hey, don't do that. David and Bathsheba, that's what can happen to anyone, no matter your power, if you stray from God, if you're not where you're supposed to be, if you let your eyes wander. But the interesting thing is, David has a nickname in the Bible. Does anyone know what that nickname is? Man after God's own heart. Absolutely. A man after God's own heart. That is David's nickname. But what's interesting, does anyone know who gave David that nickname? Where that nickname came about? You see, I always thought that it was something either one of his followers or the prophets wrote about him. They looked at David and they saw what David was doing. They're like, man, this is a man after God's own heart. But that's not actually true. We look in the book of 1 Samuel chapter 13, at the very start of David's story, okay, the end of Saul's story. Saul has been made king. He's the first king of the Israelites. And very quickly, about 3 years in, Saul messes up. Saul was the epitome of the kings, okay? He was tall, he was good looking, he was strong. They thought he'd be a great leader. But 3 years in, Saul has the opportunity. He is going out to battle, and he needs to make a sacrifice. He's trying to seek God's direction, so he goes to the temple. He says, I'm going to make a burnt offering to the Lord. But the problem was the burnt offering could only be made by a priest or a prophet. Those are the only people qualified. And so Saul's waiting to go to battle, and he's waiting for the prophet Samuel, but Samuel's delayed in coming. So Saul finally says, you know what, we can't wait any longer. We're going to lose this battle. And so Saul himself goes to the temple. He kills the calf. He offers the sacrifice before God. And as he's offering the sacrifice, Samuel shows up. And Samuel looks at Saul and says, Saul, what did you do? And he says, well, I was waiting for you, but you were taking so long. We have to go fight this battle. So I went and offered a sacrifice. It's good, right? The Lord likes sacrifices. He commands that. And Samuel looks at Saul and he says, Saul, that's the last time, man. And we see this. He says, but now your kingdom shall not continue, Saul. You see, the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. And we see that this nickname of David actually comes from the Lord himself. The Lord was the one who actually declared that David was a man after his own heart. And that's interesting because the Lord knew all the bad things that David would do. He knew how much he would mess up. He knew how much he would fail and fall time and time again. And yet God himself still said, that man right there is an individual after my own heart. Now, there's a lot of hope in that statement right there. There's a lot of hope in that story. Because I'll be honest, I love Jesus. I try to do what's right. I fail miserably time after time. And more often than not, I have the spiritual gift of sticking my foot right in my mouth. It's beautiful. And if God can look at someone like David, and we're going to look at some of the bad parts of his story and say that this individual is a man after my own heart, that means there's hope for an individual like me who messes up just the same. There's hope for my story. There's hope for redemption. There's hope for a future. There's hope for tomorrow. There's hope that this is not the end and it will not come crashing down just because there are dark moments in my story. And I hope that this message is hope-filled, pun intended, if your story is dark right now. Because I think that one thing we can all acknowledge is that life rarely goes according to plan, and it rarely stays great all the time. We all reach those climaxes, we're like, yes, this is awesome. This is where I need to be. I woke up and I was 5'7" today. But very quickly, life goes downhill. Very quickly, something takes a turn. A pandemic erupts. We lose our job. Someone gets sick. And all of a sudden, there is no hope in the world that can sustain us in that moment. But the beautiful thing is, when we look at God, when we see who he is and how he works, we're able to turn and find a secure place when things look bleak. And so what we're going to look at today is David's story. And there's three things I think about hope and David that hope did in David's life. And so I'm going to look at these three things. We're going to look at three different stories and what these stories display about these attributes of David. And the first thing that we're going to look at is this, is that David's hope led him to fight. Now, I'm not talking about like fist fights, although we are actually about to look at like a legit fight. But it caused him to fight, and it led him to fight for something bigger than himself. And the story that we're looking at for this is the story of David and Goliath. Such a great story. And there's an immense amount of hope in this story. And again, we're not talking about that first hope. I want something to be true. We're talking about the second hope. I'm hoping in the Lord. I'm trusting in God. And so the story picks up with David and Goliath. Young David, 5'6", 120 pounds, walks out to the battlefield. Now, most scholars believe that David was about 14 at this time. David was not a mighty warrior. He was not big. He was not strong. Although at this point, David had already fought off bears and lions. And David comes to his brothers. His dad has sent his brothers down to the army of the Israelites, and he said, I want you to take this bread to your brothers and these cheeses to his commander, because maybe the commander will treat them better. And so David goes down, and like any boy that's on a battlefield like this, he's intrigued by the sights and the sounds. All the swords and the yelling and the big burly men. And as he's there, the Israelites go down to battle. Now, in ancient times, what would have happened in battle, and this happens in a place called the Valley of Elah, so there would have been these two cliff sides and then a slope down to this big old valley. And in wartime at this day and age, what would happen is these armies would line up, okay, facing across from one another, however far apart, 100 yards, 200 yards, quarter mile, whatever it was, and they would stand there and they'd get ready. And the idea was you're going to intimidate the foe by the size of your army. And so the Israelites would have had tens of thousands of soldiers. The Philistines would have had tens of thousands of soldiers. And they're decked out in all sorts of weapons of war. And they're just facing off against one another. At any moment, the commander can give the call. And tens of thousands of men will rush in to do battle. Now, back then, they had this thing that could happen in war. And it was called a contest of champions. And what it was is when armies would face off against one another, instead of having bloodshed tens of thousands of people, the armies could elect one very capable warrior to go down into more of a gladiatorial style battle. Both armies would send this champion forward, and the rule was whichever champion won, the opposing army who their champion lost now had to surrender. And we look at that and we're like, well, that's dumb, Foster. Why wouldn't they just, if they're champion lost, just go ahead and fight? Because back then, people were much more concerned about honor than we are today. For an individual, a soldier, to see his champion fall and then say, well, forget that, he loses all of his honor. He loses all the reputation he would have had. And so the Philistines and the Israelites are standing there, and David comes before, he's bringing bread to his brothers, and all of a sudden, this big hulking beast named Goliath of Gath, steps forward from the Philistine army. Goliath is 9 feet tall, it tells us. And he comes forward and he starts yelling obscenities at the Israelite army. Come on down. I defy your God. Your God cannot stop you from me. Send one man, I will destroy him. And this battle can be done. And 14-year-old David hears this. And what's interesting is David's response to what happens. We see in 1 Samuel chapter 17, David goes around the camp and he asks this question. He says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine? Kid, ask your parents what that word means after church today. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And what's neat in this passage, what's beautiful, is David's concern is on the Lord's reputation. I have to be very clear about that. David's concern in this situation is the Lord's reputation. David's concern is not his reputation. David's concern is not his safety, his comfort, his well-being. He's not even concerned with his brother's well-being and safety. They're soldiers about to go into this battle. There's a good chance they're going to die. David is not concerned about that. David's not even concerned with the nation of Israel's success. Now, I want to say this. The nation of Israel's success is important, and David does allude to it in the next couple verses, but that is not his concern, his nation's reputation, his nation's well-being. David's concern is solely the reputation of the living God. Because Goliath has come and insulted and doubted the living God. Now, I'll be honest, my typical concerns, and I shared this a little minute ago, is 2 things, okay? My family's well-being and comfort, and my reputation. I'm going to be honest, okay? That's depraved Foster right there. The 2 things that get me riled up and make me frustrated and make me try to find a solution faster is if the people I care about are some kind of danger, or they're not being provided for, or if someone is wrongfully attacking my character. I'm going to be completely honest, the reputation of God is typically not my first go-to. And yet here, David hears Goliath, and the first thing that he is concerned with is the reputation of the Lord. You see, his hope was trusting that God was truly the one living God, and that if anyone was to deny that, that was a crime on unspeakable levels. His hope was so great that God was who he said he was, he couldn't stand someone defying God. Now, I think that one of the most awkward things that we can do in life is talk to family and friends about Jesus. I've talked to strangers before, and it's awkward as mess. I've told you guys that story. I do not have the gift of evangelism at all. I still am called to evangelism, but it's messy. You don't want to see me. You don't want a video of me evangelizing like how to do this, okay? But far worse than that is talking to my family about Jesus. And I think the reason is, because I talk to students about this, and we talk about what's easier to talk to, someone that you met at Walmart or your brother? And they're like, someone I went at Walmart, 100%. I think the reason is because I will always come back to my brother and my sister and my mom and my dad constantly. The stranger, I can say it, and if I mess it up and they're like, this guy's a weirdo, I'm like, well, you don't have to see me again. Good luck. My mom, if I mess it up and it's weird and awkward, guess who I have to see the next day? My mom. Right there. But one time, and this is totally by God, this was not me being good or anything like that. I worked at Chick-fil-A, and we were sitting down one day for break, and one of my coworkers came out, and he was sitting across from me, and he was just talking. He wasn't a Christian, I knew that, and he would constantly just use God's name in vain, just da, 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 da. And this one day, I decided, I was like, I can't do this anymore. And I said, hey, man, I love you. I'm not trying to be rude. I'm not trying to come across, I know it's going to come across that way, but can you please not talk about God that way? And I kind of caught him off guard. And he looked at me and goes, what do you mean? I was like, well, I'm a Christian, that God is very important to me. I hold him in very high esteem. I believe he is the real God. And I find it very offensive when you talk about him in that way. And he kind of looked at me. He was like, did the awkward, I'm not going to talk about this right now. But you could tell he was uncomfortable. And I'd like to say that it was a beautiful moment after that I went back to work after that. I was like, yeah, stood up for Jesus. I'm David. Huh. But what actually happened was I went back to my work, and the rest of the day, this guy would make snide comments throughout the store. Hey, careful what you say about him, around him, okay? He's going to tell his God about what you say. Be careful. And that went on for about 6 to 8 months. And I'm going to be honest, I didn't turn into this every time I heard it, it was like an affirmation. I'd done the right thing. That was great. No, every time I heard it, I was like, what is wrong with you? Seriously, I asked you to respect something that I hold in high esteem, and that's what you're doing. And sometimes when we have the opportunity to be like David and stand up for the reputation of God, it doesn't go well. It's messy and it's awkward, but it doesn't make it any less important. And if our hope is truly in God, we believe that God is who he says he is, we trust who he says he is, we should be very concerned with how God is taken, and we should fight for how God is perceived. And so the story goes on. Then David said to the Philistine as he comes to Goliath, you came to me with a sword and with a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. Sorry, kids. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines, sorry, parents, this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Again, David's reason for fighting, his concern here was that God would be made known. It was not for the Israelites to win. David's reason for fighting was not to protect his brothers and stop bloodshed. That was not it at all. You look back over that paragraph, and you caught it. It's pretty violent, okay? He beheads Goliath. David's reason for fighting was that the entire world would know that there is a God in Israel. And when we hope in God, when our trust is in God, when we really do think that God is who he says he is, that means that we should fight for his reputation because he is the real God. And we have to be very careful not to fight to improve our situation and make it more comfortable instead of fighting to make God known and honored. I think it's very easy. I know when I've been in difficult situations where life has seemed so dark and bleak, it's so easy for me to focus all of my effort into what can I do to improve this? Do I need to work harder? Do I need to change relationships? Do I need to change my routine? What do I need to do to get out of this situation and into a better one? And very rarely is my thought, what can I do in the midst of this pit to make God known? And I don't judge anyone for being there because I was there too. I think it's a natural reaction as a human being. But we have to be careful that our primary thing, when we actually hope in God, not hoping that something might be better, but hoping and trusting that God is who he says he is, that we are willing to make God known first and foremost. The second thing we see about David is this. David's hope led him to follow. Now, following is not a happy word in our society. Everyone wants to be a leader. I grew up with the maxim, you can be whatever you want, until I was about 17, and my mom was like, well, you can't be an NBA All-Star. I'm sorry. You got to be a little bit taller, and you're certainly not nearly athletic enough. But other than that, you can be whatever you want, okay? You can be a leader. The truth is not everyone's called to lead, and that's good because followership is a beautiful thing. I had a mentor years ago. He said, if you can't follow, you definitely can't lead, Foster, at all. And we don't teach that. But here we see that David's hope, his trust in who God was, actually led him to follow. Follow who? Well, look at this. We're going to skip ahead a little bit. David is in a cave, okay? So David's grown up a little bit. He's serving King Saul now. He's a warrior. And Saul becomes so jealous that Saul is actually hunting David down to kill him. Now, bear in mind, the Lord has promised David, you will be king over all of Israel. The Lord himself has made this promise about what his life will look like. And at this moment in time, David is hiding in a wet cave because Saul wants to kill him. As the story goes, Saul is coming after him. He doesn't know David and his men are hiding in the cave. And Saul comes in with his men to take a rest. And David realizes it, and his men are like, David, go, you can kill him now, assassinate the evil king, go and do that. And so David goes and he cuts off a strip of Saul's robe, and as soon as he does it, his heart is broken. We see this in 1 Samuel. He said to his men, the Lord forbid that I do this thing to my Lord. Listen to how he referred to Saul, the man hunting him down, wanting to murder him, my Lord. You see, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing that he is the Lord's anointed. And we see in this right here that David's hope, his trust that God was who he said he was, meant that he trusted what God did, even establishing a broken king, establishing someone who was hunting him down. David was committing to following God's lead, even when it made no sense. And I think a lot of times in our stories, when it gets dark, it's hard to understand what God is doing. God, you say you're a good God. You say you're a loving God. You say that you have a plan and a purpose for my life, and yet we are right here in this pit. Everything is falling apart. How could this be your plan? Much like David hiding in a cave, but God, you promised I would be king. How could this be your plan? You see, David would have actually accomplished much good had he eliminated Saul. If he'd taken out Saul, Saul was not a good king of Israel. Saul was leading the country into depravity, basically. He was a terrible leader. He wasn't pointing them to the Lord. He was actually blaspheming against the Lord and the things he did. Had David said, you know what, I'm going to assassinate Saul, many good things would have happened. Something we teach our students at South Lake students is that not all good things are God things. There's a difference. That one O makes a huge world of difference. You can have the opportunity to do something good, and if God is leading somewhere else, that is the wrong thing to do. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not saying that excludes us from doing good things. There are certain things that God says under every circumstance it's good. It's always good to look out for those who can't look out for themselves, every single time. I had a student years ago who spoke to me and said, Foster, I have the opportunity to go to this school that I really want to do, and I can become a nurse, and it'll be awesome. And I'm gonna make enough money that I can go on mission trips, and I can serve people. These are all good things. And he said, but here's the problem. I feel like God is leading me somewhere else. He wants me to join this nonprofit. And I was like, I'm going to be honest with you, man. One, I can relate to your story, but here's the thing. As good as that is to go become a nurse and help people and have the resources to do more ministry, if God is leading you elsewhere, that is the absolute wrong choice to go do that, even though it's a good choice. And although eliminating Saul would have been a good thing, it was certainly not a God thing. Why? Because David trusted his hope in the Lord meant he knew that God had established Saul for a reason, even if Saul was failing. And so the story goes on. Saul and Jonathan go to battle, and Saul actually ends up dying. We see David's response to the man who hunted him down as this. Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan, his son. You see, David didn't just follow God superficially. He was wholeheartedly committing to following and trusting him. He mourned when something that God had established for good fell to ruin. It's become so prevalent lately, we see pastors and church leaders falling into some kind of sin. And it becomes very public, and people are all, oh man, they need to be removed, they need to be da-da-da-da-da. And yes, there should be some kind of correction. Yes, there should be some kind of balance in there. But we see here, David's response when something that the Lord had established for good fell to ruin was he mourned, because this was supposed to be so much better. This was a man who hunted him down. David's response when he finally got what was coming to him, I'm so upset that what the Lord had established is not what it came to be. I'll be honest, my heart is ugly at this part of the message because I can count many times in my life where I've seen someone fall, that I knew God was doing something in their life, and there's a spark in my heart that goes, yes. For many reasons, the least of which is definitely, not the least of which is that it makes me feel good about myself. They fell, but I didn't. My response, I'll be honest, has almost never been to tear my shirt and mourn because what God was doing for good has come to ruin. And sometimes in our life, things come to ruin, and our response is to rage and get angry and not to mourn the fact that what God was doing didn't come to how we expected it to be. And the third thing we see about David is that David's hope led him to worship. Led him to worship. David's hope, again, his trust that God was who he said he was, led him to worship. And we see this in the story of David and Bathsheba. And this is almost the culmination of David's tale because we know the story of David and Bathsheba. David, the greatest king of Israel at this time, does something he should not have done. I had a friend ask me a couple weeks ago, we were talking about sin and depravity and all that fun stuff. And he's like, Foster, do you find that there is a cause behind your sin most often? I was like, absolutely. I can tell you exactly what causes me to sin most of the time. It's when I'm where I'm not supposed to be. That's what it is. And they looked at me, they're like, what? I was like, almost every time that I sin, now it's not foolproof. When I'm where I'm supposed to be, I still sin. But if I know that I've sinned, I can almost guarantee you I was where I was not supposed to be. And I was not where I was supposed to be. And we see this happen with David. As the story of David and Bathsheba opens, the narrative comes and it says, in the spring, the time when kings went to war, David was reclining at the palace. Because you see back then how battles were fought as the actual commander would go with the army. He was there to oversee it. He partook of it. But instead, this is a little bit later in David's life. Okay, he'd been about middle age. David has decided, I'm going to let my generals go, and I'm just going to relax in the palace in Jerusalem. He was not where he was supposed to be. And that opened the door for temptation. David is hanging out one day. He looks, he sees Bathsheba. He says, man, she's really pretty. And so he invites her over for a date. They start talking. He kisses her even though she's married. Kids, can you believe that? Golly. And then he realizes that what he did was wrong. And so David has this idea. He's like, I can't let her husband know that I've kissed her. And so what he does is he calls her husband Uriah home and he says, Uriah, I have a special message for you. I want you to go back to the army and take this message with you. And the message actually said, put Uriah at the front, and when the fighting gets bad, pull everyone else back so Uriah dies. This way, Uriah would never know that David had kissed his wife. And Uriah takes the message, and they do it, and Uriah dies. Well, David takes Bathsheba because she's overwhelmed. He marries her. They have a baby together. And so what happens is the prophet Nathan comes to David and he goes, you know that what you did was wrong. This one man in your nation had a wife and you took his wife from him. How dare you? And David's response is so beautiful. In 2 Samuel, we see this. David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And I think that worship begins with acknowledging that God is God and that we are not. I had a mentor years ago. He said, Foster, do you know what the number one problem facing every individual person is? I said, yeah, absolutely. Lack of quality food. He's like, no, not at all. He said, the number one problem facing every person in the world is authority. He said, every human being wants to be an authority unto themselves. Now, we have leaders we like and we submit at times, but nobody actually likes having someone in authority over them. It comes to a point we want to do it our way. But if we want to truly worship, we have to acknowledge that God is God and I am not, which means that God is in charge. If my hope is in the Lord, if I trust that he is who he says he is, that he is God, that means that when he says something is right and something is wrong, it is right and it is wrong, whether I like it or not. And we see this beautiful moment. The story of Bathsheba is terrible, but David comes and he says, I have sinned against the Lord. Now, it's thinking me uncomfortable to address, but it's vitally important for us to do so. When I was at Global doing camps, our speaker, Roger, was giving a message one night, and he was talking about what if your sin had a physical consequence? What if every sin had its own unique physical consequence? You steal something, your hand falls off. Huh. And then he got to the good one. He goes, what if every time you lusted, one of your eyes fell out? And he's like, if you knew that was going to happen, how many times did you do that? And there was a 17-year-old boy in the back of the room, as innocent, as serious as can be, said, twice. I was like, amen, brother. I'd like to tell you 0, but I know how dark my heart is. I wouldn't be here. None of my body would be here. Whatever the consequence was, it would be gone. My spleen fell out because I was a glutton, whatever it was. But we see, although our sin doesn't have this physical consequence all the time, it is super deadly to our bodies, to our relationship, to our community, and to our souls. And the first part of worshiping is acknowledging that God is who he says he is, that we are not, and therefore when we do something wrong, we actually do a crime against God. We teach our students that sin is actually rebellion against God. It's not you just did something that was morally wrong, although yes, it's morally wrong, but it's also rebellion. And so the story goes, Nathan said, because you've committed this sin, David, your child will not live. He's going to die. And so David falls down. He starts fasting because the baby's born and it's sick. And he's weeping and fasting and the baby dies. And then we see this. It says, David arose from the earth, washed, anointed himself, and changed his clothes. He went into the house of the Lord and worshiped. And this blows my mind. I'm not a parent, but I can't imagine losing my kid and the first thing I do being I go and worship. I think more often than not, I would probably be angry at God. yelling. I remember sitting on a mountainside when all the stories seemed to be crashing. I was like, God, you wrote this good story. You promised good things, and now it's falling apart. How dare you? What are you doing? How did you get it wrong? I was not worshiping, much less in the midst of death like this. And the people asked David, well, why would you do this? He said, well, while the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who knows whether the Lord will be gracious to me? You see, his hope, he trusted that God was a God of grace. And therefore, there was a chance, okay? There was a chance in the midst of his sin that God could still be gracious and the child might live. But now he's dead. The Lord chose not to. So why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? No. He is gone. I shall go to him, but he will not return to me. And this last part is beautiful. I will go to him. David's hope in God, he trusted that God was good enough that the story would have a redemption, that he would see this baby again one day, that the Lord was still working even in the midst of his sin. He had complete hope in the goodness of God. You see, David's life was constantly filled with worship in the midst of difficulty. Our Wednesday word this week was talking about Psalm 57. And Psalm 57 is this beautiful psalm that David wrote, and he actually wrote it while he was running for his life from Saul, okay? Remember, the Lord had promised David, you'll be king. And now he's hiding in a damp cave, and it's like, God, all of your promises have fallen through. I'm hiding for my life. And David writes this psalm, and it's absolutely beautiful because we see the way that he is responding to his circumstances. And we see the hope that he places in God and not the hope that he's wanting to see happen in his circumstances. And this is what we see right here. It says this. I'm going to read the psalm to you. Just listen to David's words. Be merciful to me, O God. Be merciful to me. For in you my soul takes refuge. In the shadow of your wings I will take refuge till the storms of destruction pass by. I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me. Remember, he's hiding in a cave. All the promises have seemed to have fallen short. He will send from heaven and save me. He will put to shame him who tramples on me. God will send out his steadfast love and his faithfulness. My soul is in the midst of lions. I lie down in fiery beasts, the children of man, whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth, while he's hiding in a cave. They set a net for my steps. My soul was bowed down. They dug a pit in my way, but they have fallen into it themselves. My heart is steadfast, O God, my heart is steadfast. I will sing and make melody from the midst of a cave. Awake, my glory, awake, O harp and lyre. I will awake the dawn. I will give thanks to you, O Lord, among the peoples. I will sing praises to you among the nations, for your steadfast love is great to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. David is hiding in a cave after a promise that he would be the greatest king Israel would ever see. And his response is this: I will praise you so passionately, God, that I will wake the dawn back up. The sun will rise just to see who could possibly be praising this much. That's what David's hope in God did. In the dark situation, it wasn't just, I want my circumstance to be better. His hope said, I trust, God, that you are good enough to redeem this story, even when I can't see the ending. But how could a story like David's be filled with such hope? How can any story that's been derailed be redeemed so drastically? My quiet time earlier this week, I was reading through the book of Mark. In Mark chapter 2, Jesus is in Capernaum, kind of his base of operations, and he's teaching in a house. The crowds are flocking to him. They're asking all these questions. They want to know more about Jesus. And in the midst of it, this crowd presses through, and they're carrying a paralyzed man. And they can't get through to Jesus because of the crowd, and so they say, we'll take him to the roof. And his friends carry him to the roof, and they start ripping apart the roof of the house to lower their friend who's paralyzed down to Jesus. And this is Jesus' response. We see this in Mark chapter 2. When Jesus saw their faith, the friends, he said to the paralytic, son, your sins are forgiven. I want you to read this with me again, okay? Jeffrey, you can go ahead and throw that next one up there. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, son, your sins are forgiven. Jesus offered restoration on the basis of faith, not faithfulness. That's important. We have no idea whether these friends were Jews and they followed the law. We have no idea how morally correct they were, how righteous they were. Jesus makes no allusion to whether or not they did the right things. Jesus simply says, son, because of their faith, your sins are forgiven. Your story is restored. Get up, take your mat, go home. Now, that doesn't excuse us from the moral law. But what I do see here, much like in David's story, is that this hope, this trust in a good God who is gracious, if Jesus is concerned about the faith of those around him more so than their faithfulness, I think the same applies to me. I think Jesus is more concerned with my faith than my faithfulness, although my faithfulness is important. And that means that when I mess up, when I'm in a situation with Bathsheba, where I am where I'm not supposed to be, when I am running for my life and my story is broken and falling to pieces around me, rather than sitting back and wanting my situation to be better, if my hope and my trust is in God, the God who is gracious, the God who redeems stories, the God who can continue writing, then I think my story will continue to go on. It doesn't make the pain less. David still lost his baby. But we can place our hope in Jesus, trusting he will be just as gracious with us. That's the hope of the gospel. A God who loved us in the midst of so much sin, he said, I am sending my son to right it and save you because I love you, not because you've done well. As you lead today, this is the one thing I want you to take away from this. We've looked at David, we looked at his hope, and the one thing I want you to take is this. Hope is more about who God is and less about where we are. If your story is awesome and you don't need hope, that doesn't matter. God is still constant. If your story is so dark and so deep and there's nowhere else to go for hope, that doesn't matter, because hope, that trust, is based on who God is. Your story will be dark. Your story may get good, but it will flip-flop a lot. But regardless, God will always be steadfast. My heart is steadfast, O God. I will awake the dawn. That's the hope that we learn from David. I'm so grateful to get to be part of this church. I'm so grateful to get to do life with you guys. Thank you for being here each week, for serving with us in our community. We're very excited to get to continue this series for the next few weeks. I'll actually be back next week, so I'm sorry you got to put up with me for 2 weeks straight, but we'll have a great time with that. As you go through your week, I hope that this, no pun intended on that one, that this will give you hope as you realize that God is someone you can place your hope and your trust in. Let me pray us out real quick and we'll go ahead and leave. Father, thank you for loving us. Thank you for being so gracious. Thank you for providing for us. I pray that you would show us that you are a God worth trusting, that you are gracious, that you are good, that you are loving. I pray that you would bring hope to these dark stories, Lord, when things get difficult, and that our eyes would constantly be drawn to you. Jesus, I love you so much, and I pray all these things in your name. Amen.